welcome. I'm Richard Campbell. The director of the journalism program here. And it's nice to see such a good turnout for our event this evening with Dr. Daniel Ellsberg, Government Secrets and Nuclear War in the Middle East. I think this is particularly appropriate given what North Korea has apparently done yesterday to talk about these issues. I think they're important. I want to thank some folks. First, this panel was sponsored by the John W. Altman Humanities Scholar in Residence program and the Diana Stark Journalism Lecture Series program. And I also want to thank our journalism faculty member, Barb Morgenstern, and her students for putting this program together this evening. They've done a very good job. Dr. Ellsberg's going to speak for a little bit, and then we have a distinguished panel that's going to come up, and we're going to have a little bit of a conversation, and then we hope we allow plenty of time for question and answers afterwards. So right now I'd like to invite Barb up here to introduce Dr. Ellsberg.
Thank you, Dr. Campbell, and good evening. Before I introduce our speaker this evening, I wanted to remind students who have to write stories or papers on tonight's event that we have a program here, and Steve Uhrich, one of my independent studies students, has put together a website. The address is at the very top, and it's chock full of all the research materials that will give you background to get good grades on your papers. There's also biographies on the other side. And our speaker this evening, Dr. Daniel Ellsberg, is a fellow Midwesterner, having grown up in Detroit. He earned his undergraduate degree and then his doctorate degree in economics at Harvard in 1962. Like so many of his generation, Dr. Ellsberg then began his Vietnam-era career as a United States Marine Company commander, a Pentagon official, and a staunch supporter of America's battle against communist expansion. But in October of 1969, Dr. Ellsberg, with the expectation of spending the rest of his life in prison, set out to turn around American foreign policy by smuggling out of his office and making public a 7,000-page top-secret study of decision-making in Vietnam, eventually to be known as the Pentagon Papers. Because of that decision, Dr. Ellsberg has become known as one of the nation's most impassioned and influential anti-war activists, and is reputed to be the most important whistleblower of the last 50 years. The release of the Pentagon Papers, first to the New York Times and the Washington Post, set in motion a chain of events that included a landmark Supreme Court decision, the arrest and trial of Dr. Ellsberg, and the crimes of Watergate. Because of the Pentagon Papers, there is a strong consensus that Dr. Ellsberg's actions helped end not only the Nixon presidency, but the Vietnam War. Recently, Dr. Ellsberg has captured national headlines in the wake of his Harper's Magazine article in which he expressed his regret and guilt over not whistleblowing earlier in the Vietnam War. In his essay in Harper's, Dr. Ellsberg speaks directly to current government insiders, encouraging conscientious insiders to leak hard evidence to the press and public about the administration's serious plans for the war in Iran. Dr. Ellsberg, you've been in every major newspaper in the United States, but in the nature of today's media, your appearance several weeks ago on the Colbert Report, shall we say, it tends to motivate our students to sit up and really listen to what you have to say. In 1973, because of the Pentagon Papers case, Dr. Ellsberg appeared on the cover of Time magazine with a headline which read, "The War Exposés, Battle Over the Right to Know." Now, some 30 years later, the same query is under heated debate. What is the public's right to know balanced against national security in the aftermath of 9/11? A public university such as Miami should be the ultimate forum for the marketplace of ideas. Consequently, contrary views, questions that challenge Dr. Ellsberg's positions are very welcome during the question-answer segment later on. Personally, this is a compelling subject for me on this particular day, as it is laced with a particular emotion. For today is my father's 85th birthday, and he is celebrating it at a big party in Washington, D.C. with my brother and family. I have a favorite photo of my dad at my home in Cincinnati. It was taken in Dusseldorf, Germany when he was a soldier in World War II, not much older than our students here. My father's image frozen in time on another continent, fighting a war in the prime of his youth, helps me fully appreciate having this discussion tonight. No matter whether one agrees with Dr. Ellsberg's position, I think we can all agree that there is much at stake when the subject is war. We would now like to begin Dr. Ellsberg's talk first with a look backwards more than 30 years with a clip of Meet the Press from 1973. We would then like Dr. Ellsberg to respond to the same questions that were posed to him 30 years ago, which are just as timely now as they were then. So if we could start the clip now.
On June 13, 1971, the front page of the New York Times featured a photo of a smiling President Nixon escorting his daughter Tricia on her wedding day. But the middle of the front page contained a story that, through a strange chain of events, would lead to a landmark Supreme Court case on press freedoms, and eventually to the Watergate scandal and Nixon's own resignation. The headline read, "Vietnam Archive, Pentagon Study Traces 3 Decades of Growing U.S. Involvement." The person who leaked the classified Pentagon papers to the New York Times was defense analyst Daniel Ellsberg. He appeared on Meet the Press several years later, and on that occasion he spoke about the case that changed history.
Mr. Ellsberg, whatever else you may have accomplished or not accomplished by disclosing the Pentagon papers, many people, I believe including you, felt that your trial would help establish some ground rules or answer some questions about the security classification system, government secrecy, freedom of the press. Do you think it's done so, or did the way it ended just leave all those questions hanging in the air as much as they were before?
I don't think they'll ever again try to convince an American jury that historical documents of the kind in the Pentagon papers, even if they are stamped top secret, could damage the national interest and thus come under the espionage laws.
Mr. Ellsberg, wise men made the point centuries ago that liberty without order is anarchy. If every person with official access to classified information took it upon himself to decide what should be made public, how could orderly government be maintained?
That's a constant problem. It can never be an easy one. They'll never be able to reveal such things without risking their jobs if their superiors don't want it revealed.
Because of our involvement in Vietnam and because of what has happened at Pentagon Papers and the Watergate case, a great many of our youth have lost faith in our institutions. Have you?
I never did, and I'm glad to say right now I have never had more hope, not based on faith but on evidence of what I see these days, that our government is functioning. Our government is not the president. Our government is not the executive branch. Those other branches of government are functioning to protect us from abuses by the executive branch, and they have never functioned better in our history.
And we'll be right back.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Well,
Barbara was asking me earlier, I hadn't seen the clip, but she wanted me to address the questions that I posed 35 years ago, almost 30 years ago. I'm afraid I couldn't answer that last one as hopefully or optimistically as I did then. The First Amendment is at this moment under great attack by this administration, and for years there's been an erosion very steadily. Very few people were aware then, or still are to this day, that the prosecution of me and my co-defendant, Tony Russo, was the very first prosecution there ever had been of a person for giving a leak, for giving information to the press, as opposed to espionage. We have no Official Secrets Act, which criminalizes giving out of classified information to unauthorized persons, the way most countries do, such as Britain even, and nearly all other countries do have that. So what I did was not clearly criminal at that time, although I didn't know it myself, nor did the papers, the newspapers to whom I gave it. We all acted, in other words, on the assumption, I think, that we were breaking some law, and certainly I did, having held a clearance at that time. In fact, it was about a year into the legal proceedings that my lawyer, having studied it for about a year and finally having to conclude that there was simply no precedent at all for this prosecution, told me that apparently what I had done had not violated any law as far as we could tell. And I was very cheered to hear that, and I said, well, I'm home free then. He said, well, it's not as easy as that. He said, when the Justice Department comes into court and says to the jurors, the U.S. versus Daniel Ellsberg, and 12 felony counts, each of which was good for 10 years, one for 5. So you can't be sure you're going to walk out of that room free in the end. I said, well, what are my odds? He said, 50-50. I said, 50-50? You know, 115 years in prison, and I haven't broken any law, and it's 50-50? He said, well, let's face it, Dan, copying 7,000 pages of top secret documents and giving them to the New York Times has a bad ring to it. And in the end, as Sandy Younger there had asked, you know, whether these questions were resolved at the time, they were not, because my case was dismissed. All charges were dismissed at the end of it after nearly 5 months in court, just before the trial went to the jury, on grounds of governmental misconduct against me. A pattern of misconduct, the judge said, which offends a sense of justice and which precluded resolving the issues fairly. So these issues of whether indeed we did have a law that could be interpreted as an Official Secrets Act, namely the Espionage Act, which had been intended for espionage and which had only been used up till that time against espionage, whether that could be constitutionally interpreted as an Official Secrets Act. And that wasn't tested then because it didn't go to the jury. There's been only one prosecution since then of Samuel Loring Morrison, about 10 years later, for on the same charges under the Espionage Act. He was found guilty and went to prison for about a year. But since his appeal was not heard by the Supreme Court, it provided only a limited precedent, and the question still remains somewhat unresolved. Is it or can it be criminal to put out classified information just per se, without any question of the intention to help a foreign power or hurt the United States? There is, in fact, a case right now in front of the courts, so-called AIPAC case, American Israel Political Action Committee, is that what AIPAC is? Political Affairs, Political Affairs Committee. Anyway, it's more or less an Israeli lobby in which two people are being charged with having received classified information and retaining it, not giving it to the Justice Department. Same provision that was used in my case. And if that is successfully used to convict these two people, and if that's upheld by the appellate courts and the Supreme Court, we then will have an Official Secrets Act. And the effect of that will be that from then on, with a clear-cut crime every time you read in the paper
that this is a classified document, or this draft is a classified paper, or if they quote anything, that could be used not only against every reader of the newspaper, the New York Times, who would then be in unauthorized possession of classified documents. Not too likely they would use that. But what they would use is simply to bring journalists in front of a grand jury, as they did Judith Miller in the New York Times case, in the Plain affair, I should say, and say, we're not charging you, but a crime has been committed here. So I'm saying the reason they haven't done that yet, until Judith Miller, was they didn't have a clear-cut law to go after. But if Congress either gives them a new Official Secrets Act or this case goes against AIPAC, they will then say someone has clearly committed a crime here, giving classified information. You know who it is because it was in your column under your byline. Who did it? Just tell us. And if the journalist will not tell them, they go to jail for contempt. Now, Judith Miller spent 85 days in jail before she went back to her source and asked if he would release her from it. And maybe she would have spent longer. There are journalists, I think Neil Sheehan, to whom I gave the papers, would probably have spent longer in jail and not told. But most won't. Again, as some people give in and to avoid jail, others will do the same. And from then on, they really will not be able to give leaks, to print leaks, without the expectation of being found out by the reporter, that is, reporter telling on them. And we'll have government by handout, essentially, then, only. Now, it won't be a total absence of leaks. I should say, by the way, my wife hates me being called a leaker, generally. She feels it makes me sound incontinent. And there isn't a really good term for it. Unauthorized disclosure. It's a little clumsy. But that's about all there is. The other terms for it are even less complimentary. Actually, I got an award for whistleblowing, or whistleblowing actually, in Germany a couple of years ago. And just before I got the award, I asked the judge who was going to give it to me, judge of their administrative Supreme Court, what's the German word for whistleblowing? And he said, well, we don't have a word for whistleblowing. I said, well, very good to be in a country that has no need for a word for whistleblowing, but what's the closest to it you can think of? So he said, Verräter, which is traitor. So I said, is there possibly another word you can think of? We came up with Petzer. They all agreed that was a good synonym. Tattletale, which is pretty much the way it is in English or any other place. These are the other words would be snitch, rat, informer, canary. It has a very bad connotation, actually. It's giving information that you have promised not to give, in the case of government officials, as I had very often promised, not to give out this information, breaking a promise, breaking a contract, proving unreliable of trust, and of letting down your team, of betraying the people who activities are exposing and whatnot. Not charges that anybody likes at all to be charged with. But what if the secrecy that you promised to keep is concealing evidence of criminal activity? And let's say not just ordinary crimes, but of lying a country into a wrongful war, providing reasons that are necessary to get public support for a war that couldn't get that support if the information were put out truthfully. And so you find your president or your department head lying, reasons why we're attacking Iraq or Iran or Vietnam that you know are untruthful. Now, there will be people inside who may understand that there's lying going on. If you couldn't stand being associated with lying, you really couldn't be in the government more than a week or two. It happens all the time, and it's regarded as one of the acceptable tools of governing a very complicated job. And you have to be able to say different things to different audiences, even when they're contradictory. But suppose you know, or feel you know, that the war you're being lied into, or the law that is being broken, as in the case of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, FISA, and you know, as a member of NSA, National Security Agency, two things about that program, which started right after September 11th, or possibly before it. There's some indications now it might have started earlier. The NSA wiretaps. And supposing you know, on the one hand, having all the clearances, that essentially no information is coming out of that of great use to national security or essential use, which is what people have claimed from inside. And on the other hand, that this is a very, very serious violation of the Fourth Amendment of the Constitution and provides the executive branch with a basic tool for tyranny, for an invasion of millions of people's privacy on such a scale that they can be blackmailed away from dissent and into informing on their fellow citizens, as in East Germany or Czechoslovakia or the Soviet bloc places. And it's, in short, it's a very serious infringement of our rights and our democracy. And that is your judgment, as opposed to somebody who says, well, we're being lied into the war, but the war is necessary, it's important, and the people might be so isolationist as to feel that they wouldn't get into it unless you lied to them. All right, those people who support the policy, as going into Vietnam, for example, are not going to feel strongly challenged by the fact that the president is doing a little misleading in the course of it. Supposing, though, like very, very many people in the government, you understand, and this goes beyond what I knew at the time, but a lot of other people did, that this is going to be a hopeless, disastrous war, illegal, against the UN Charter, against the Constitution in that it involves bypassing Congress, basically manipulating them into giving support to a war that would not be supported truthfully. In other words, one of the worst oppressions that a ruler can inflict on his people, an unnecessary and wrongful war. What should you do then? Well, what should I have done when I knew that, let's say, in 1964? I knew that every statement being made about the President and the Secretary of Defense on our supposed retaliation to an attack on our destroyers, which in fact did not happen, that every statement they were making was false. Actually, well, I could go on that. What should I have done? That's the question. I can tell you what I did do, which is what virtually all, to a first and second approximation, people did. I kept my mouth shut. I worked for my boss, Secretary McNamara, or my immediate boss, an Assistant Secretary of Defense. It never occurred to me that I had any responsibility or right to break my promise of keeping secrets by exposing that to Congress. Is that the best stance for a public servant? I can tell you that that's virtually universal, unanimous. It's very hard to find exceptions. I could name a couple of exceptions of people who did tell at the time and who generally were punished fairly severely for it. I wasn't, unfortunately, one of those. So I can't look back and say that I did anything at that time to avert the war, even though, in fact, I was very critical of it. I thought the bombing was not going to achieve anything except kill a lot of people uselessly. I didn't approve of it at all. I was less against our support of the Saigon government with ground troops. In fact, I volunteered to go over as a civilian the next year, precisely because I was ignorant of the history. I had no basis for knowing that that was our notion that we were supporting a sovereign government in Saigon against aggression from the north, that was just as false as the statements that we had been attacked in the Tonkin Gulf, a single incident that didn't happen. And in fact, the history of that showed me that when I finally did read it in '69, 5 years later, in the top secret study, I realized that that was just as false, and the war had been unjustified from the very beginning. I believe that if I had come out with what I knew in my safe, what I had in my safe in '64, '65, and showed that the president was undertaking a vast hoax, that in his statements during an election year, that we sought no wider war, when my colleagues and I were working 7 days a week preparing for a wider war as soon as the election should be over. it never occurred to me really at that time that I really had taken another oath that was in conflict with this oath of secrecy. I don't think that ever came to me really. And that was the oath to uphold the Constitution. Strictly speaking, that's the oath you take. Every official, every civilian, every military man takes an oath not to a commander-in-chief or a president or a party, simply to uphold and support the Constitution. And that's usually interpreted as doing your job, obeying the orders of your bosses, keeping the promises you've made of secrecy and so forth. It really doesn't occur to anybody that there could be a conflict between those two promises. And yet, if we thought about it, and I'm trying to get people to think about it inside, that conflict arises daily in many situations when the President or the Secretary of Defense is lying, when he's talking about progress, when the private reports he's getting. Bob Woodward, for example. How many saw the 60 Minutes or one of the other things? Let me see, Bob Woodward a little while ago. Well, very dramatically, he put a chart on the wall, if you saw during the program, secret chart, stamped secret, which is rather low in the Pentagon. But it showed a steady increase in the number of incidents in Iraq against our own troops. Had a date on it. And then I think, I've forgotten the date, but it might have been, I've really forgotten, but a recent year. And it showed that within days, possibly even the same day that that chart was delivered, the Secretary of Defense and the President were saying steady progress is being made. Well, progress in the number of attacks on our troops, that was the secret. Supposing you had that document, it wouldn't occur to most people having it any more than it occurred to me. That's a contradiction that I don't have a right to sustain, to uphold. The public deserves to know whether we're feeding troops into a situation there that is serving our interests and which is on the route to success, or that we're not. And somebody did leak that. Now, I'll mention one other thing. He had a number of leaks in there from his book, which are mostly based on anonymous leaks, unattributed, various people. Notice that when he did that, immediately Condi Rice said and others said, oh, that meeting didn't take place. There's no record of it. In this particular case, other people, Condi Rice had to backtrack on that. And the State Department said, well, we do have a record of such a briefing by Tenet at the time. But typically, when Richard Clark, the former counterterrorism chief, or now Woodward, report a meeting like that with no documents to back it up, they can be sure that they will be called, that they made it up, that it was misremembered, that somebody is lying. I learned from my own experience that it makes a great deal of difference to have the documents. So that Woodward could say in that case, you know, don't argue as to whether this was a disgruntled employee or not presenting this. This is what was reported, and they haven't denied it. And yet you were saying the opposite to Congress. In short, the people who kept quiet about that chart, and that's just one example of a million you could name, were in fact violating their oath to uphold the Constitution when they understood that Congress was being lied to, or in the case of an election year, that the voters were being lied to. Specifically, I'm sure it just didn't occur to them. I'm trying to put that in the heads of some people to shorten the time interval for me and for others between that time when you really become aware that the public is being terribly manipulated and misled and the time when you do something about it. In between, there's rather likely to be a period in which you tell your family, your spouse or something at night what's really going on, you might. Or when you actually put out a leak to Woodward, which is a good thing to do. Or when you really go further and give them a document, which is much more likely to be traced and offers you the risk, much greater risk. Now, today, of course, I hadn't planned to get on to the subject you're talking about, nuclear war in the Middle East, and of course now we've just had a nuclear explosion apparently in the Far East, in Korea. And so I've had to recast a little what I was going to spend my time talking about here. By the way, how much time do we have here? 1 more minute. Oh, I don't know. Give me a little bit more than that. Okay. Because it occurred to me We got from Nixon, very crucially, years later, and only partly full still, the tapes that were done in the Oval Office, which of course are not documents. But Nixon would have remained in office had not Alexander Butterfield broken his promise to be totally secure about revealing that there was a taping system. And he told the prosecutors that there was a taping system, and after a great many travails, they were able to get the taping system, or the tapes, rather, of these things. Now, what I learned from Cy Hirsch, who was doing research on this, that the reason they went after me in ways that led to the ending of my trial and actually helped bring down Nixon were based on the fact that Nixon believed that I knew his nuclear threats against North Vietnam now, and might have documents to release them. He knew that I knew people who had known that from the National Security Council, that I was in contact with them. It was very reasonable of him to fear that they might have given me documents that would prove that. And that was at a time when the American public would have been very worried about making such threats. They wouldn't necessarily expect them to be successful, and they then feared that any use of nuclear weapons might lead to a response by the Russians or the Chinese and blow up the world. Nixon didn't fear that, actually. He was making nuclear threats. They were very secret. To this day, very few people are aware of them, although they are available on the web. And I wanted to just give you a feel for the kinds of conversations that I think are going on now, this week, with respect not only to North Korea, where I'm sure this test has reopened the question of how to get how to punish the North Koreans and get their nuclear program for this act of non-deference to the public, this little country defying us, and also against Iran. The U.S. has been using its nuclear weapons over the last year or so with respect to Iran, using them the way that almost every president has used his nuclear weapons since Hiroshima, by pointing it at somebody, making threats, which means that he's using the weapon just the way that somebody in a dark alley is using a pistol when he points it at somebody's head and makes demands. If he gets the demands without having to pull the trigger, that's the best use he could make of that weapon. And he couldn't make those threats without having the weapon. And it's in order to make such threats that we have the weapons and continue to build more right now. I just wanted to quote one thing here now from my book, Secrets. And this was a passage that my wife and I spent a long time transcribing. It's a little hard to get it off the tapes because there's a lot of noise of teacups and things, and it's hard to tell who's saying what. We finally got it. The North Vietnamese had just launched a heavy offensive in '72, which the president had hoped to deter by his threats, but instead his threats had failed. He had been making threats of nuclear weapons actually since '69, with the public not knowing that. That was a secret. As I say, if I'd had what I'm reading here, if I'd had evidence of that, I would not have bothered putting out the Pentagon Papers, literally putting out history that applied mainly to the Democrats. I would have put out current knowledge, which is undoubtedly what they're afraid of now. It's the kind of thing I'm asking people now to put out before the war, before a bomb is used in Iran, even if the result, among other things, is to put the person who reveals that in prison. Because I'm trying to talk to people who know that this would be disastrous, would lead to disastrous effects, and there are many, many such people in the government. People who have, Cy Hirsch, for one, and Philip Giraldi, a former CIA station chief, have said there are many people who have made plans on the direction of Cheney, who was, by the way, in the White House at this same time here, back then. The direction of Vice President Cheney have made plans for nuclear options against Iran. And as I say, when something comes up like this, I think those things are all renewed. So if you want to hear what the discussions sound like, here is from the tape of Nixon on April 27th, 1972. It was the middle of my trial. I hadn't yet gone before the jury. We've got to stop thinking in terms of a 3-day strike, says Nixon. We've got to be thinking an all-out bombing attack. Now, by all-out bombing attack, I'm thinking about things, I've heard these tapes many times, so I slip into the Nixon speak here. I'm thinking about things that go far beyond. I'm thinking of the dikes, I'm thinking of the railroad. I agree with you. That's Kissinger. We've got to use massive force. Then later, 2 hours later, he's talking to H.R. Haldeman, his chief of staff, and Ron Ziegler, his press secretary. President, how many did we kill in Laos? Ziegler, maybe 10,000, 15? In the Laotian thing, we killed about 10, 15. See, the attack in the north that we have in mind, power plants, whatever's left, petroleum, the docks, and I still think we ought to take the dikes out now. Will that drown people? About 200,000 people. No, no, no. I'd rather use the nuclear bomb. Have you got that, Henry? That, I think, would be just too much. The nuclear bomb, does that bother you? I just want you to think big, Henry, for Christ's sakes. And then later, a week later, finally, when he's really on the verge of going on this, he said, the reason we've got to do this, bring the North Vietnamese to their knees, we must not lose in Vietnam. So we must draw the sword. So the blockade is on, and I must say, I like it. And I must say, I want this clearly understood. The surgical operation theory is all right, but I want that place bombed to smithereens. If we draw the sword, we're going to bomb those bastards all over the place. Let it fly, let it fly. Now, one of the things revealed in the last week by Bob Woodward is that Henry is back, that he has been the most consistent advisor to the president on foreign policy of anyone outside the government, and that his theme has been, we must not give in to a loss of will in the public or the military or our allies. We must keep this thing going because, I was just reading this quote from the Woodward book, they're trying to humiliate us, and we cannot allow them to humiliate us. And we must take any effort to keep that from happening. So in discussing this, Nixon is thumping his desk as he points to an imaginary, maybe a real map on it. You hear these thumps in the tape. And I'm quoting this because I think this is the language of empire. This is the language of someone who thinks he's a king and has every right to rule the world, but is being defied at this moment, and for that reason must act very, very strongly. Vietnam. Here's those little cocksuckers right in there. There they are. Here's the United States. Here's Western Europe, that cocky little place that's caused so much devastation. Here's the Soviet Union. Here's the Mideast. Here's the silly Africans and the not quite so silly Latin Americans. Here we are. They're taking on the United States. Now, God damn it, we're going to do it. We're going to cream them. This is not in anger or anything. This whole business that I'm petulant, that's all bullshit. I should have done it long ago. I just didn't follow my instincts. I'll see that the United States does not lose. I'm putting it quite bluntly. I'll be quite precise. South Vietnam may lose, but the United States cannot lose, which means basically I have made the decision, the decider. What Bush is not the first decider. Whatever happens to South Vietnam, we are going to cream North Vietnam. For once, we've got to use the maximum power of this country against this shit-ass little country to win the war. We can't use the word win, but others can. And in another hour, he says to Kissinger, the only place where you and I disagree, Henry, is with regard to the bombing. You're so goddamn concerned about the civilians, and I don't give a damn. I don't care. Kissinger, I'm concerned about the civilians because I don't want the world to be mobilized against you as a butcher. This is what's being discussed now. in the Oval Office, probably in pretty much the same terms, a little bit different accent. The fact is, I would say that people who are aware of these discussions, as some clearly are, and who regard them as appalling, that's the word used by both Philip Giraldi and Seymour Hersh, would, I think, do well to go beyond what they've done so far to make these subjects of public discussion and debate, and to allow Congress, even a Republican Congress, to deal with it. They have, I think, to let us know in time at this point in detail, and if they are, as they say, appalled by this, they should be willing to take some personal risk to do it. Putting out the kind of information I'm calling here will almost surely subject them to prosecution, even with no new change in the law. They might go to prison for it. But against that, as I came to realize in 1969 and 71, there's a situation here with a corresponding thing, making the changes from Vietnam. We now have 147,000 young men and women who are risking their bodies and their lives every hour of the day over there. And that's taken as natural, as just patriotic. They're doing their duty as citizens. And unfortunately, it's time now for civilians in the government to understand that it can be their duty to take comparable risks with their own lives, even with their family's livelihood, when a war's worth of lives is at stake, as it is right now. I hope that some will hear this call and save us from an otherwise disastrous course of events. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ellsberg, for your comments. We'll continue this discussion by involving our two other panelists. I have the pleasure of introducing my colleague, Richard M. Goehler. Mr. Goehler is a partner in the litigation department of Frost, Brown, Todd in Cincinnati and is a member of the firm's executive committee. His practice is concentrated in the areas of media law, advertising law, and general commercial and business litigation. He represents media clients in pre-publication, pre-broadcast review matters, defense of defamation and invasion of privacy claims, and in access to public records in meetings disputes. He also handles trademark and copyright matters and regularly counsels and advises on advertising review, clearance issues, sweepstakes, and promotions. Mr. Goehler is chair of the governing board of the National American Bar Association's Forum on Communications Law. He is a charter member of the Defense Council section of the Libel Defense Resource Center and has written extensively on libel. Most importantly, Mr. Goehler received his BA magna cum laude from Miami University and his JD magna cum laude from University of Notre Dame Law School. So we asked Mr. Goehler to come up here and expand on the law surrounding this.
Thanks very much, Barb, and thanks for not telling the audience just what year that was that I got that AB from Miami. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and for just a few brief moments, what I'd like to do is put tonight's discussion in the framework of the First Amendment from a media lawyer's perspective, and to do it this way. To cite Justice Hugo Black's concurrence in the U.S. Supreme Court's June 30, 1971 Pentagon Papers decision, where he said then, the government's power to censor the press was abolished so that the press would remain forever free to censure the government. The press was protected so that it could bear the secrets of the government and inform the people. I'm going to say that again and again in connection with tonight's discussion. The press was protected so that it could bear the secrets of the government and inform the people. But in times like today and in times then, in times of national security crisis, there's a real tension between that in terms of what that protection brings. And that tension is between the First Amendment's guarantee of a free press and the patriotic duty to protect American lives and uphold national security. This puts the media in an uncomfortable position. Here's what some have recently said about that tension. Quote, "It is about revealing classified secrets in a time of war. And the media has got to take responsibility for revealing classified information that is putting American lives at risk." Another commentator said it a little more strongly. Quote, "We are at war with a bunch of people who want to hurt the United States of America. And for people to leak that program," this was the story on global banking records, "and for a newspaper to publish it does great harm to the United States of America." It's a quote from President Bush, June 16, 2006. And a local senator, Senator Jim Bunning, a Kentucky Republican, said it even more strongly. He accused the New York Times of treason. Editors at the nation's top newspapers describe a deliberative process guided by intense questioning, a willingness to pull back on technical details that could endanger lives, and ultimately a commitment to informing the public about the government's use of power. Whenever the government makes a request to the press to withhold information on the grounds of national security, newspapers go into the discussion feeling there's got to be a powerful reason not to publish. If the government has a compelling case that a life is in danger, some would say that's an easy call. Some would say that the newspapers do not publish. But if the government is going to cite the war on terror every time a newspaper is going to publish a secret, that makes the newspaper more skeptical. Newspapers do the best they can to check it out. They do all the reporting they can and then have to make a judgment, which is very difficult in these times. The overriding job, the most important job of the press, is to cover the government and its use or abuse of power and authority. Is the New York Times guilty of treason? Has the New York Times violated the Espionage Act? Some have argued that the Times should be prosecuted for publishing its NSA article on warrantless searches and surveillance of Americans. I know you want to hear from our other panelist, John Seigenthaler. We'll leave that as that question about prosecution under the Espionage Act for some of the discussion in our panel discussion and for some questions by you. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. When Barb proposed this panel to me with Dr. Ellsberg, I thought, given that we're a journalism program, we needed a person who was not only a contemporary of Daniel Ellsberg, but who was also an eminent figure in journalism, who could help us think broadly about journalism's point of view about the issues raised here tonight. I thought of only one person, my friend John Seigenthaler, who over a 43-year period has served as a reporter, editor, and eventually publisher and CEO of the Nashville Tennessean. John is also founding editorial director of the USA Today and held that position for a decade while also running the Tennessean. After his retirement from the Nashville and the national newspaper scene in 1991, John founded the First Amendment Center at Vanderbilt University in Nashville. For more than 30 years, John has also hosted a book review program on Nashville Public Television, and his own latest book on President James K. Polk came out in 2004. John has had a long and distinguished career as a journalist, and he is one of my journalism heroes. But I think his even greater legacy is in the area of civil rights. After earning a Nieman Fellowship at Harvard in the late 1950s, John went to work for Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy as a special assistant and point person advising the Freedom Riders in the South. In 1961, John was attacked by the Klan in Birmingham, Alabama, and had his skull fractured by a lead pipe. More than one civil rights activist has argued that this was a turning point in the civil rights movement and really got the Kennedy administration energized about going after segregationists. And if you want a really nice recounting of this, I recommend David Halberson's book, The Children. I see John's work in the movement directly connected to Oxford and the 1964 Freedom Summer, where more than 1,000 activists trained here at Western College to work registering black voters in the South. 3 of those workers, James Chaney, Michael Schwirmer, and Andrew Goodman, were murdered by the Klan in Mississippi the day after they left Oxford in 1964. For those of you who are a little younger, you may know John's name for a couple of other reasons. His son, John Michael, is the weekend anchor for NBC Nightly News and a reporter for MSNBC. And in 2005, John became embroiled in a battle with Wikipedia, where someone posted a defamatory comments about him in his bio, which stayed posted for more than 4 months until John discovered it and Wikipedia removed it. Good reporter that he is, John actually tracked down the culprit. And I invite those of you who want to know more about this story to come to our COM 143 class tomorrow at 9:30 in Laws Hall, where John will talk about this. Please welcome John Seigenthaler.
Thank you very much. I thank you very much. I thank you very much, and I particularly thank my friend Richard Campbell. As you can tell from that introduction I wrote, I am a legend in my own mind. And I would like, before I begin, to apologize to 2 young students who met me on the way in and asked for my autograph. I may have seemed a little rude, but as you can tell now, fellows, I am not Dr. Daniel Ellsberg. And Dan, they'll both be looking for you as soon as we come down. I'm honored to be here. I love this place. I've been here before. This turnout tonight is phenomenal. It's a great tribute to one of the great heroes of this country, Dan Ellsberg. I want to begin, Richard, I think, with a question you left hanging. And that relates to the other side of the equation, the journalistic side of the equation. Dan Ellsberg decided, as an act of civil disobedience, that he would risk his liberty by making a statement that he thought patriotism, true patriotism, required. He leaked those documents to the New York Times. June 13th of that year, the New York Times published the first in a series of documents. On June 14th, the very next day, the New York Times was notified by the Justice Department, Attorney General John Mitchell, that they might be prosecuted under the Espionage Act. It was a direct threat to the Times, and inside that news organization, we all might imagine the discussions that must have gone on. There must have been demands up and down the line by lawyers to find out what really had happened. Looking back on it, it's clear that the decision to go and then to go again was ultimately made by the publisher, Arthur Sulzberger, Punch, as he was known, the father of the current publisher of the Times. Isn't it ironic that after all these years, 35 years later, the same newspaper, by a different Justice Department, is hit with the same charge of violating the Espionage Act? Now, I'd like to talk for a moment about the commitment of the journalist who accepts Dan's information or the information from any whistleblower and enters into an agreement to keep the name of the whistleblower confidential. Now, it was not long before other papers in the country received some leaks. I remember it well. I was one of the editors who was trying to track down Daniel Ellsberg so I could be guilty of committing the Espionage Act too. Journalists all over the country really wanted to be a piece of this action. We wanted to support this newspaper that had made the leak, and Dan made it possible, I think, for some other papers to do that. But when the commitment is made by the journalist to the whistleblower, what is it that goes on in the journalist's mind when he says, I won't tell? Yes, there may be one news executive who will insist, but I will assure you that that person will bear the same responsibility I bear, and he or she and I will be prepared to go to court, to go before a grand jury, to refuse to testify, and to go to jail for contempt. Dan's act of civil disobedience then passes to the reporter, because those reporters know that the Supreme Court of the United States has held that there is no federal shield law and there is no federal protection to a journalist called to respond to a subpoena. I know there are journalists who think there is a First Amendment right simply to say, I'm not going to tell. Nothing will happen to me. Well, something definitely will happen to you. You well may go to jail for contempt. Earlier tonight, I heard Dan say that he worries that that ironclad commitment on the part of many journalists has dissipated. And if we look at the last year, we find that this whole idea of confidential sources has been, as civil disobedient, journalists are civil disobedient professionals, has been damaged by a series of events that shake me as I look at the profession of which I was part for well over 4 decades. Think of it. Think of Matt Cooper, a reporter who, in a very brief online communication story, reveals the fact that a CIA agent, Valerie Plame, is who she is. I won't go into the details of the story, but Cooper has told someone in government, I'm ready to go to jail. I make a commitment, civil disobedience. Just to follow up on what happened after Dan's exciting and courageous stand, the next great story in which whistleblowers were involved was Watergate. And I think the Washington Post sort of set a standard for all of us in this business in Watergate. You know the story. Woodward and Bernstein have deep throat. Bob Woodward had met him, Mark Felt, briefly, developed a relationship with him. Now, Bob Woodward says to Mark Felt, I'll keep the confidence. I'll keep your name secret. I'll go to jail. Yes, I may have to tell my colleague Bernstein. I certainly am going to have to tell my editor, Ben Bradley. You can be sure my word is their word. We will keep that name secret. And they do. They do. And even after Mark Felt dies, even after his family acknowledges that he is who he is, that he is deep throat, even after he himself comes forward and he is on the verge of death, Woodward has grave reservations about revealing what has already been said. Matt Cooper, fast forward, takes the information from a government source with that pledge, and he keeps that pledge. His news executive, Norman Pearlstein, unlike Bradley, blows the whistle and surrenders the information to the grand jury. Total betrayal of the commitment to civil disobedience. There have been a half dozen cases during this last year in which the rule is violated or obscured, decimated in a couple of cases. And there is no longer an understanding, I say, inside the journalists you represent. There is no longer that absolute understanding of how you will perform and why you will perform. Yes, you will fight it in court until the judge says contempt of court. But you and those with whom you share the information are committed not to divulge it. And that is an act of civil disobedience that, from my perspective as a journalist, is as required as a matter of patriotism as it was required of Dan Ellsberg. And there I'll stop.
For the audience, just for some clarification purposes, you're right, 30 years ago there were threats from that same Justice Department to the same paper of prosecutions under the Espionage Act. And those threats continue today. Today, in addition to just threats, Dr. Ellsberg also made reference to a case that's going on where there is a prosecution under the Espionage Act, and while it's not presently against journalists, the APEC litigation is clearly a prosecution under the Espionage Act, and so that current times show not only a threat, but in fact action to prosecute. Secondly, with respect to the events of the last couple of years when it comes to the reporter's privilege, the other side of this equation, when a reporter makes a promise to a source that the reporter will keep that source's identity confidential, we've seen some litigation that has not gone well for the journalists. The Judy Miller case, where Judy Miller was actually sentenced for contempt of court to serve time in jail, and she served some 85 days. And again, these aren't easy issues by no stretch. There is, as I think I indicated in my remarks, there is a debate that goes on every day about these issues, but the reporters today are worried about their ability to carry out on that promise to their sources. They're worried about their sources. They are worried about scorched earth tactics to get at what the identity of those sources are. And in Matt Cooper's case and in Judy Miller's case, there were not only strong litigation pressures, threats of contempt, threats of jail, but then also faced with blanket waivers, where the government goes along and secures waivers of the promise from these sources and then faces the reporters with the argument, well, all of these sources have waived, they're basically giving you the ability now to reveal the name. We're putting waivers out there, and now you don't have to worry about that promise that you've made. Again, I'm not saying that to justify things. I'm just saying that that's part of the legal environment in which this is being played out today. Okay. Questions from the audience? I'm sure you've been sitting here patiently. We do want to get your involvement in this. We have microphones in the aisles. Folks who can step up, please do so. Over here, Joe.
Hi, to our panel, thank you, all of you, for being here. Dr. Ellsberg, I have a question for you about comparing the Plame affair to what you had reported on. In the Plame affair, it appears that the administration had leaked her name to damage a critic of the administration in the war. regardless of whether they should keep that source confidential or not, as the journalist, do you have some type of obligation to try to distinguish between trying to prevent a war's loss of lives or when you're just carrying out the administration's bidding?
Well, I heard that addressed to me, but of course I'm not a journalist, I'm a source. And so I don't see it quite from that attitude. On the Plame case, you had a real, let me mention something now that I think a distinction very few people became aware of during the Plame affair with Fitzgerald and so forth. I said we don't have an Official Secrets Act, as the British do. We don't have a general Official Secrets Act that applies to all classified material. What we do have are 3 narrowly defined Official Secrets Act that criminalize the disclosure of certain 3 types of material. One, the one that was involved in the Plame case, the identities of covert intelligence agents. And she was a clandestine intelligence agent. She was covered by that. Second, nuclear weapons data, particularly design data, restricted data. And third, communications intelligence, including not only ciphers and codes and code breaking, but actually the product of the code breaking, the messages that are heard. Now that's a very wide category actually, but it's still a very narrow and pretty narrowly defined category. Those 3 bills are generally regarded as constitutional. And I've never had a particular objection to them in the sense that these are areas where, on general, the public doesn't have a need to know very sensitively. Take the fact that we've broken the Iranian code or something like that. The public doesn't really need to know that. And it's very costly to the nation, national security, if it is known. And it's narrowly defined. So that act would certainly pass constitutional muster. Now that was involved in the Plame case, and thus Fitzgerald was on good legal grounds in this case when he brought in Miller and Cooper, because a clear-cut law, a relatively clear-cut, might have been broken. Actually, that wasn't as clear-cut as it turned out, because the conditions, you have to know not just that it was a intelligence agent that was disclosed, but the person disclosing it to be criminal had to know it was an intelligence agent that was currently being protected and so forth. And that's very hard to prove. But that showed what will happen if you get a general Official Secrets Act. Then any classified leak, and there's something in the paper every day, virtually, classified leak, could lead to the same process of a Judith Miller or who's ever byline. She didn't actually publish anything, but you could pull somebody in to do it. So that's what I was saying would be very dangerous. You can live with these others, basically. And in fact, so much so that I've rethought, really, my tolerance of those laws to a certain extent. Because we've just seen, with the Judith Miller case, when they have a chance of a clear-cut law where they can pull the journalist in, Fitzgerald, who I must say I admired generally what he was doing, I had a lot of confidence in him, but looking back on it, I have to say it was not a good precedent to be pulling a journalist in like that, because the public at large doesn't realize that distinction, and they just say, oh, now they're pulling journalists in, and it seems rather natural, and they would hardly notice if the law was extended. By the way, when I mentioned, maybe I mentioned at dinner, or did I hear the following question? How many people here knew that Congress had passed a General Official Secrets Act in late October 2000? How many people knew that? Do I see any hand? First time in our history. And Clinton then vetoed it, and I presume you didn't know that. You didn't know there was a law. That means the public is so ill-informed on this subject, by other media, for example, that they'll hardly notice. They won't necessarily notice if that law is passed. And they won't realize how much our First Amendment privileges have been constricted until they'll notice when journalists begin to be pulled in just automatically all the time. And they may or may not then notice that they're not getting any leaks anymore. And they may or may not care. I would care.
Question over here.
This question is for Dr. Ellsberg, but I'd like everyone to make this question is for Dr. Ellsberg, but the question is for everybody. Dr. Ellsberg, in your book Secrets, you wrote, it became clear to me that journalists had no idea, no clue, even the best of them, just how often and how egregiously they were lied to. Is your statement still accurate today? And specifically, how does public information under this administration compare with those during the Vietnam War?
Yeah, could you hear that?
Oh, I'm sorry. All right, I'll read it again.
Louder.
All right, in your book, Secrets, you wrote, "It became clear to me that journalists had no idea, no clue, even the best of them, just how often and egregiously they were lied to." Is your statement still accurate today? And specifically, how does public information under this administration compare with those during the Vietnam War?
Yeah, I think it is. Could you hear that now? The question is, do journalists really realize how often and how effectively they are lied to? And I still feel that is very much the case. When a book like Woodward's comes out, indicating with what he's saying now that either he was lying in his earlier two books about the relation of the president to his advisors and who was the commander decisively taking charge or whatnot, and now this picture of a very indecisive, passive president, not very ill-informed, those are two very different pictures. Now, either he was lying earlier in order to keep on good terms and get access, or he was being lied to. Whenever you get revelations like this, I think it would be very useful for the readers, for you people, in other words, as well as the journalists, when they read that, to ask, first, how come we didn't know this earlier, years earlier? Who was lying to who on this, and how effectively? I think Woodward, let's assume he was in good faith earlier. Is he going to go back over his earlier quotes then from the earlier two books? Let me just guess, not, because journalists don't usually look back and criticize their own performance up till then. But it would be good if he went back and looked and said, okay, why did I print this false statement earlier? Who misled me? And how did they get away with it? How was I convinced? Was I overly gullible here? Or what gave me the clue? But a reader can ask the same questions every time you hear any revelation, whether it's about NSA wiretaps or anything, saying who was misleading us and why were we so credulous? Were there some principles we were going on that set us up to be fooled so easily? I have no doubt in my mind at all that the public remains very susceptible to this, and so do the media. I used to see this so much in the Pentagon, where my own boss, who was a former Harvard law professor, would have me in while he was talking to a reporter, and I would sit there and just listen to him lie blithely, very effectively, throughout this conversation and get away with it. Nobody ever called him on that. And that was a requirement for someone in his position, not just to be willing to lie, but to be able to do it effectively. He was a Harvard law professor who, when he was lying, his accent, his family came from southern Illinois, Pekin, Illinois, I believe. And he would just get this thick accent. It'd be a country boy, as though he had hayseed stuck in his teeth or in his lapels or something, cuffs of his trousers. Just a very credulous person who would never lie to anything, would give bald-faced lies one after the other. And I think, I've never met a reporter, I think, who really realized how much they were fooled.
More questions from the right.
Thank you. Dr. Ellsberg, I'm kind of concerned about kind of the exclusively American nature of the whistleblowing appeal that we're hearing tonight. This weekend, a Russian journalist was killed who was very involved in whistleblowing in regard to Chechnya. Also this weekend, an Iranian Islamic cleric was arrested for resisting the Iranian government's desire and ongoing efforts to erase Israel from the map. And yet, we're hearing kind of these sad stories about how we need to stop the bombing of Iran. We also know that the whistleblowers in Iraq who told us that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq are hardly thought of in heroic terms. What is your call an international call to whistleblowing? What are people supposed to do outside this country when they want to call into question some very illegitimate things that go on? We're having a really fascinating conversation about American journalists going to jail, but international journalists face death, and we seem to supremely exalt war and stopping an American war as the foremost moral concern. How do you view that?
Well, it certainly is a need. We're blessed first with the First Amendment. That's why we don't have an official Secrets Act. As I say, few people are aware we don't have it, or why we don't have it. They are not aware of the relation of that to the First Amendment. But the First Amendment, as far as I know, correct me on this, was essentially invented as a restriction on government, a constitutional amendment that has to go through a whole amendment process to be changed, and fortunately hasn't been changed. So we're in a very privileged position, both from the point of view of journalists and readers. And as I say, even though people don't realize there's no official Secrets Act, there have been only 2 prosecutions up till now, and I think that can change, and we could get much more like other countries. Now, of course, in countries unlike Britain, which has an official Secrets Act, but is of course a relatively free, liberal democracy, the comparison of that to the countries you name of Russia, one could say, for example, Colombia, where being a journalist exposing the drug trade is almost suicidal. And yet, reporters do continue to cover it. I'm always astonished by the courage that you see in these countries, Iran and other places, and of course used to be under the Soviet Union. Specifically, I'll give you both a hypothetical and a real case on the question of nuclear testing. I would say that the onset of testing by India, of course, predictably, everyone would have predicted, would immediately lead to Pakistan testing, as it did within about a week. That happened to be a case, oddly, where the CIA seemed to be taken very much by surprise. Never been able fully to explain that, because the party in power, the BJP, had been calling for a renewal of testing all the time. Now they were in power, and they tested. So it's odd that the CIA didn't take them for granted, and was caught by surprise. What if one of the thousands of Indians who must have known that that test was underway, 10,000? A nuclear test is not done by half dozen people, sitting in a back room somewhere. Of the thousands of people who knew about that, how many would know that on balance, this is going to be a disastrous move for my country, India? It will lead immediately to Pakistani testing, to an unstable balance here that's going to make the world much less safe, and specifically India. Such a person would know the arguments to be made for it, but they would also know the overwhelming arguments to be made against it, that it was going to lower the security. What if such a person, one or more, had revealed that beforehand? Here's what's going on. Here are the documents. It's not just me. They would have been reviled as the worst kind of traitor in India. Probably would have been put in prison, might very well in India have been assassinated. And yet, here they're in the position of somebody who had the chance to let the international community know about this, and U.S. pressure specifically had earlier been effective in stopping either Pakistan on the one hand or India from doing it, and certainly could have, almost certainly, could have been effective in stopping that test, which was very bad. Same is true of Pakistan, if they knew about this. In other words, now, those are the hypothetical cases. Supposing someone, in other words, had taken it on themselves to do that, it would have been very good. Not appreciated in their own country, but appreciated by many other people. One person has done that in the nuclear era. How many of you here know, I'm sure there are some, of Mordecai Vanunu? How many know the name Mordecai Vanunu? That's all, huh? Not fewer than I would have supposed, actually. But Mordecai Vanunu was worked in the Dimona nuclear weapons production facility in Israel. And now the world as a whole knew pretty much that Israel had a nuclear program. They'd known that for some years. We refused to confirm that because it would have raised questions of aid to Israel as a country that had covertly produced this. But that would have been no great surprise. What he revealed, what he decided to reveal, because as a Jew then, he later converted actually, but as a Jew then, he felt that it was wrong for Israel to have such a large program as it did, and to be going into hydrogen weapons, fusion weapons, which are 1,000 times more powerful than the atom bomb. So he took pictures inside the facility, which were a surprise, remember, to know, well, the fact that there was a nuclear program was not a surprise to any government. They all assumed Israel had that. It was a surprise even to the United States, though, which did not know they were that far along and they had that many weapons. For example, even to this day, when it's mentioned that Israel has weapons, you'll usually see a figure like 200. Well, that happened to be a figure that was around maybe 30 years ago. And they've been building weapons ever since. Almost surely, I just saw today a figure of 400 to 600 in connection with the North Korean test. It's the first time I'd seen 600 in print, which is almost surely much closer to the truth. His thought was that this program, which was totally secret from Israel, its citizens, should be a matter of political decision by the Israeli people. Do we need this many programs? Does this serve our security or hurt our security? Well, he did put it out. He gave it to the he gave his photographs to the London Sunday Times. And just before they appeared, Mossad agents lured him to Italy with a woman that he just met, who urged him to come and take a vacation in Italy with her. And once in Italy, he was given hypodermic needle in his apartment, shackled, put in a bag, smuggled aboard a boat for Israel, brought back to Israel where he underwent a secret trial, and with no press, no public admitted, under military laws. Actually, the law they prosecuted under was a British occupation law, which they had preserved since '48, written by the British Occupation Authority. And he was then put in prison for 18 years, of which 12 of them, 11 and a half, were in a cell which I believe was 6 feet by 9 feet, with the lights on, day and night, for about 9 of those years. Conditions that Amnesty said were uniquely oppressive for any. Finally got out after 18 years, but because he insists on talking that Israel should discuss this subject, should be a debate, and so forth. He was ordered not to discuss it. I'm sorry, that was the law. You can't discuss it. That's the British occupation law, under which he was then threatened with being put back in prison. They won't let him out of Israel. He's under, in effect, house arrest. And he wants to leave, but he can't. So this is, of course, what Nixon had in mind for me. I was charged with 12 counts for 115 years. But I didn't get it in this country because the charges were dismissed. But I can say, though, I've come to know Mordecai quite well, in correspondence, and then I've visited him in Israel, now that he's out. And he's no question in his mind, A, that he would do that again, and B, that it was worthwhile, and that he will not comply with the directives telling him that he must not discuss nuclear matters in any way with people. So he's the one prophet, I would say, of the nuclear age who did actually risk his all and paid it, pretty much paid it. He may pay more in the future. He may go back to prison. I was willing to do this, and it does seem to me that in such circumstances, one should be. I admire very much the Colombian journalists and the others who risk their lives and get killed all the time. And I think on lesser scale, that's just revealing drugs in a way. It's not as big news, you might say. But on something like this, absolutely. Would have been good if some North Korean had told this, or Iranians. It would be very good if somebody did that. But it unfortunately doesn't take the threat of death or of life imprisonment to keep journalists or insiders from putting out truths even when they feel it will save many lives. I'm puzzled as to why that is as effective as it is. It does seem to me there should be more of it, and that's what I'm trying to encourage.
Okay, we've got a few more minutes. Let's try to get a few more questions in quickly over here.
This question is for Mr. Seigenthaler. You spoke about Matt Cooper and of Time magazine and how he made this promise of confidentiality to his sources, but ultimately his publisher went over his head and gave the information, gave Matt Cooper's notes to the government. Given that, and given the current reality of the pressures on journalists in the field doing their job, the pressures on them to reveal their sources, and the fact that their bosses could turn against them. What is your view of the future of investigative journalism, especially investigative journalism involving national security? Is the journalism of the Watergate era dead? Are you an optimist or a pessimist?
Well, I can't look at what's happened to a whole string of reporters, and Matt Cooper is one. The reporters involved in the Wen-Ho Lee case, this is a different case, and I'll be very brief about it, but government sources leaked the word that Wen-Ho Lee was very probably a spy. And reporters took that off the record, and I think all of them were prepared to go all the way with that. They would have gone, I think, to jail if faced with a contempt citation. Now, this is not the government seeking to find out from the journalist who the source in the government is. This is Wen-Ho Lee and his lawyer seeking to find out who the government sources were. And you know, you think about that, and you have to have a little sympathy for Wen-Ho Lee. Somebody lied about him, and he wants to know who. The journalist, on the other hand, has taken the pledge, and these journalists expected to live up to the pledge. How is it resolved? The owners of the publications pay off Wen-Ho Lee for a total of $750,000, once again, not allowing the journalists to go to jail where they were willing to go, and we still don't know who the sources are. The sources are protected. I mean, you can guess who they were. I'm pessimistic about it. I don't think the industry has come to grips. I don't think professional journalists have come to grips with how this dissipation, this denigration of a policy that has to make sense if journalists are going to continue to do what they were able to do when Dan Ellsberg was willing to blow the whistles. So I am indeed pessimistic about it. If you ask me where it started, I think during the Clinton administration, if you look at who was leaking what about Bill and Monica, on one side you had the independent counsel and enemies of the administration. On the other side, you had Clinton's lawyers and friends of the president. And I will tell you, if you read a book called Warp Speed by Bill Kovich and Tom Goldstein, they document in that case how deals were cut by the source, by the leaker, with journalists about where the story would go, when it would play, and where it would play. So I think there has been a general diminution of the policy, a commitment to the policy. I think there is great confusion about the policy right now, and Dan Ellsberg's right, and Richard, I'm sure, knows it's true. It will ultimately dry up sources, and Richard deals with that question of waivers. You know, so Scooter Libby leaks to Matt and to Tim Russert and to Judy Miller. He leaks, and the president says, I want everybody to sign a waiver. If you did it, tell the reporter you release them from the pledge. You know, under duress, they all do that. You would think that a journalist under those circumstances would say, not good enough. You know, he's got to whisper in my ear, she's got to whisper in my ear, and tell me that indeed I'm released of that pledge, or I'm prepared to go to jail. And there was and is, I think, an unwillingness when those waivers come down to go back to the source and get a firm commitment on that. Now, it's not universally true. There are many journalists who are true to the system, but as long as you have an example, like Noam Pearlstein, the Time publisher, or these corporations that are willing to pay off the plaintiff in order to keep the secret and to keep the reporters out of jail, it does get in the way of my confidence in the future of the system.
Let's do this. We're at the appointed hour, but I want to give this gentleman right here the last question, and then my co-panelists will be up here for a few minutes. For those of you who are still anxious to talk, you can come on up. Let's have the last question right here.
Okay, thank you. There seems to be an inverse relationship between gas price and presidential popularity. Do you think that war in Iran, nuclear or otherwise, would cause a rise in gas prices high enough?
Say it a little louder for me.
Okay, sorry. There seems to be an inverse relationship between gas prices and presidential popularity. Do you think that war in Iran, nuclear or otherwise, would cause a rise in gas prices high enough to devastate public opinion? And how much do you think that public opinion affects the U.S. decision-making in this area?
Asking me?
Yeah.
I think the obvious effect of an attack on Iran on gas prices, which is almost sure in a variety of ways. The Iranians take their own oil off the market, or they attack oil in Saudi Arabia or elsewhere, or they attack ships, tankers in the Persian Gulf. One way or another, there's very likely to drive up gas prices, and that in itself will be unpopular in itself. But who will be held accountable for it? The Iranians, from all the reports that have come back from Iran, people who are there now, both in the government and outside, feel very confident that there will be no attack. And the number one thing in their mind is, well, for two reasons. Say the U.S. is too involved in Iraq. They're ignoring that this would be an air attack, not a ground attack, almost surely, and would not be precluded by our involvement in Iraq. Second, they say that this effect on the world and our retaliation, and in particular the effect on gas, would be so heavy that it would be crazy for the administration to do such a thing. I think it would indeed be crazy. I think their mistake is to think that that means that the administration will not do it. That's not a joke, unfortunately. An attack on Iraq was just as crazy, seen as much, especially with the forces that they did it with. And also, by the way, had the opposition of nearly all the Joint Chiefs, as does an attack on Iran. And nevertheless, they went ahead with it. These are basically the same guys. Don't they learn from Iraq? Well, I wouldn't single them out as statesmen who don't learn from their own mistakes. Very few statesmen do that, actually. Do learn. They don't learn. On the contrary, they say, we didn't do it big enough last time. The basic approach was all right, but this time we'll really do it. And that's what we get from Washington. So I think the anticipation of higher gas prices is not reliably going to stop them from doing it. And they'll go on the grounds that we need this for national security. I'm afraid that this North Korean test is going, despite the fact that it is the result of 5 years of not talking to the Koreans and not refusing to talk to them bilaterally or to give them the assurance they won't be attacked, which is, after all, for which the nuclear weapon is a substitute. You won't tell us you won't attack us, even with nuclear weapons, then we'll get a deterrent. But I'm afraid that, in fact, instead of being held accountable to Bush for that, there'll be a notion much more in the administration. This is a very dangerous world. We can't allow Iran to get weapons like North Korea. We've got to move in a timely way. And even though CIA says that the weapon is 5 to 10 years away, they can say, well, how do you know that? There may be a secret program and so forth. I think it will increase the ability, or at least the administration will think it will increase their ability to get away with this. So, who was it? Was it Lincoln who said, you can't fool all the people all the time? You can fool all of them some of the time, and fool some of them all the time. They don't need to fool all the people all the time. That's an irrelevant observation. All they need is to fool enough people, enough of the time, and they're very confident they can do that, and they have a basis for that confidence. They're really good at that. They're really good at fooling people. I would like, by the way, to end on one brighter note about the media. I've said, after all, there may very likely be an Official Secrets Act before long, I think. or if this APAC case is decided against the defendants, you'll have, in effect, an Official Secrets Act. Will that completely cut you off from information? And I have to point out, not only did I believe that there was in some kind of Official Secrets Act that I must be breaking by what I was doing, and I believed I would go to prison for the rest of my life, which is what Nixon had in mind. The newspapers mostly thought that too. And I think John raised the question of what was going on in their minds as they faced this demand. Well, we know quite a bit about that now, and it's very creditable of the newspapers. They really were worried about injunctions. They were worried about stock offerings that some of them were giving. I think that the Post was right in that problem. They were worried about what this would do to their franchises for TV stations and so forth, and definitely about prosecution. And yet, not only did the Times go ahead, despite the request, to cease publication. They only stopped when they got a court order to cease. But the Post then picked up, and it wasn't only the Post that did the same. I then gave it to the Boston Globe. They were enjoined. Then I think this Christian Science Monitor was next or something. Anyway, ultimately there were 19 newspapers.
You never got down to the Nashville, Tennessean, damn it.
I'm sorry, I didn't have the contacts. My father was a lifelong subscriber of the Christian Science Monitor, so that's how they got it. Basically, by the way, I had a criterion that I tried to follow of people who had been strongly against the war. Where was the Tennessean on that?
Well, he was strong against the war by that time.
Very good. So, sorry, I apologize.
I accept the apology.
No, really. And I know when you said that, my point is precisely this. There were newspapers like yours. Not one paper to whom it was offered turned it down or hesitated for a moment.
No, I'm sure.
Just as you wouldn't. And really, there's never been enough recognition of that, the meaning of that, as there deserves to be. 19 newspapers published in face of daily statements by the President and the Attorney General. This is endangering our national security. I am the Commander-in-Chief. We're in a war. I tell you that this is disastrous to our national security. And 19, and faced prosecution, not only denunciation as traitors. And 19 newspapers, one after another, looked at the documents themselves and said, we don't agree with the Commander-in-Chief that this is against national security in a war. And our responsibilities as journalists call on us to print this. It was a wave across the country, one after another, of civil disobedience that I don't think, not only had never been seen before in journalism, but I was thinking recently, I can't think of any societal institution in any country that actually, any democratic country, let's say, or otherwise, that on their own basis of their own judgment lived up to the standards of citizenship and their profession in defiance of the government. It was really a marvelous time. And I don't say that it might or might not be as likely to happen today. It wouldn't be more likely, but it might be less likely. I don't think it's ruled out, though. I think that faced with the courage of the Times and the Post and the Boston Globe and some of the others, and Post-Dispatch was also enjoined, other papers wanted to get in on that and think of what that meant. They wanted the honor of a prosecution or an injunction from the state. They deserve very great credit for that, and that's where my hope for this country resides, in that kind of behavior.
And you should say that when the Times case went to the court ultimately said to the Justice Department, you have not made a case that this disclosure was any threat at all to national security. Just before we go, if I could just add one line to the question that was asked me a moment ago. If I were teaching journalism today and expecting students to become professional journalists, in their minds, as they read the history of American journalism, particularly the modern history, this issue of confidential sources is going to come up. I would include in that instruction absolute mandate. When you go to work for newspaper, television station, radio station, online publication, find out what the rule is. Don't promise to go to jail and keep the word unless you know you're working for an institution that's going to support you to the jailhouse door and beyond. Because ultimately, it's the first question that's going to confront a young reporter when he or she is in one of those troublesome situations and someone has information the public needs to know, and it could be something of great magnitude or something of important local interest. And unless that reporter knows the institution, the publisher, the owner, the organization is going to stand behind him, it further dilutes the integrity of the system to make that promise and not be able to keep it.
Ladies and gentlemen, thanks for coming out tonight. Thanks for your participation. Please help me in